Hello and welcome to another astrology podcast. In this podcast, I will be talking about the astrology of addiction. It's an interesting topic. I mean, addiction is not something that most people who are concerned with astrology are often concerned with. And that's the reason why I'm going to talk about it. As usual, this is coming from a lecture series which I conducted in 2018 for an audience of astrologers. I'd like to share it with you. The Astrology of Addiction. Here we go. The only reason why we have complex brains is because the world really is very complex indeed. We have complex brains because such complexity is needed to perceive the simplicity we do in the world. In fact, the major challenges in artificial intelligence creation today revolve around important questions regarding our cognition and how it simplifies the world. Point in fact is that we do not know what we are or exactly why we are different from all other animals and plants which we see around us. Some have put it all down to genetics, genomes, and other physiological considerations, but these arguments have huge holes in them, like for instance, why is the genome of an axolot almost 10 times bigger than that of a human? And yet humans are undoubtedly more sophisticated than the axolot. An axolot is a type of amphibian. The difference between humans and other living things on Earth cannot just be down to genome size or other such physiological considerations, at least not naively. Here's my take on the matter. A human being is different because in humanity, the physical laws of nature have reached a bit of a quandary. They have become so entangled in their interactivity and expression that they have broken through a fundamental barrier, a barrier which also acts in the form of a trap. Within this trap, the laws of physics have pulled into a container in such a way that specular reflection has now occurred. Specular reflection is the reflection you see over a still lake or in front of a flat mirror. In the case of humanity, though, what is being reflected isn't light, but the complexity inherent in the physical laws of reality. It is this reflective capacity which we call self-consciousness, and it is a product of the trap-like barrier in our heads. Within the human cranium, organic fatty molecules were sculpted by the nature of sensorial awareness, driven to limits by the efficiency and ruthlessness of natural physical laws, until a threshold was reached where this highly tuned sensory organ, which we call our brain, collapsed its function back on itself. It is this ability of the brain to collapse its finely tuned array of senses back on itself that we have labeled self-consciousness. It has much to do with the emergence of a logarithmic spiral, but that is another matter entirely. It also has something to do with the distribution of prime numbers, but that is another matter entirely. If you're interested in that, you can look into my book, The 5 Principles of Organized Complexity, for more information. It is on the back of these set of ideas that we shall now begin our investigation into the nature of addiction. Commentary. Now, basically what I've tried to say in this opening few paragraphs is that in order to understand addiction, you need to understand the nature of self-consciousness, because we need to define the essential quality of addiction, and then we need to sink down into its core, the core essence of that definition, to try to figure out what is it that makes up the nature of addiction itself. What is it within self-consciousness that basically demands an individual be so compulsive about an activity which they perform. And anytime we go into the realm of self-consciousness in terms of exploring the psychology of the human brain, we ultimately open the door into astrological concerns, because astrology is basically the language for human psychology. Whenever human psychology is being discussed, it's just a different type of language. I know modern day psychologists have their language and how they describe human psychology, but astrology is much older than anything modern, and it is from that vantage point that I'll be carrying out this investigation. Moving on. A quick search on Wikipedia defines addiction as a brain disorder characterized by compulsive engagement in rewarding stimuli, despite adverse consequences. This is as simple a definition as you get regarding this condition and will suffice for our use here. However, it is important to point out the difference which exists between addiction and dependency. Dependency is a physical stimulation process which has been enabled by a hijacking of the reward system employed by the brain, and for which there are physical and physiological implications, often unpleasant, upon cessation of the stimuli. Addiction does not necessarily come with implications for cessation, and these two terms are often used interchangeably and incorrectly. The literature covering addiction and dependence is huge, and this is testament to its importance in healthcare, especially in the world we live in today. It is estimated that addiction-related issues cost the United States economy more money than the cost of all diabetes and cancers combined. This is phenomenal. A succinct review of the scientific literature shows that addiction and dependence have been traced to the overexpression of a truncated splice variant of the FSOB gene called delta FSOB. Delta FSOB functions as a sustained molecular switch and master control protein. This gene splice has been implicated in all manners of addiction and drug dependence, where it triggers a host of transcription events which ultimately lead to addiction. There are a few other culprits, but delta FSOB is far and above the major biochemical culprit in addiction. Prolonged addictive drug use, for instance, causes gene expression alterations in the dopamine pathways of the brain, and delta FSOB is the chief culprit in this alteration. In simple terms, what delta FSOB does is enhance the brain's ability for dendrite plasticity, thereby effectively hijacking the reward systems in the brain. From my point of view, the fact that delta FSOB may be implicated in addiction and dependence does not mean that this protein causes addiction. My take is that delta FSOB acts as a gatekeeper or orchestra conductor for the numerous pathways in the brain which control the sensation of reward. In all cases of drug dependence and addiction, delta FSOB is found to be overexpressed, thereby demonstrating increased dendritic density. Commentary. Now, in the scientific literature which I have reviewed, this gene delta FSOB has been implicated in issues of addiction, and and how it's impaired, how it causes the impairment of the reward system. But I'm also suggesting that there is a deeper meaning beyond the genetic of other physiological concerns, and that is that deeper meaning that I'm going to explore in this analysis once the literature review is complete. So, moving on. In my post on clinical depression, I discussed the origin of thought forms. I asserted that no one knew the origin of thoughts and concluded that thoughts arose out of the vacuum created by humankind's ignorance of its true nature. I presupposed that the first real thoughts arose for the first time when a man or woman suddenly looked around in amnesia, no longer recalling who or what they were, and then being confronted with the cold fact that they never knew what they were in the first place. These first thoughts must have filled the first thinking humans with dread. So in a sense, thoughts arose as a form of cognitive dissonance in the first men and women. It is within the identity gulf which opened up in humankind's concept of himself that all we have come to know and understand has grown to fill. Everything we know of in existence is somehow located in the gap formed between total amnesia of what we are and the truth of what we really are, whatever this may be. This gap represents the sum total of our imaginative faculty, and we perceive this space to be limitless. It is this perception of limitlessness which drives and motivates everything that we do, and every personality role that we play. The paradox, though, can be found in the very simple fact that at one time in the past, we knew, without the slightest iota of doubt, exactly what we were, in just the same way that other animals know exactly what they are, without being aware of what we knew, or what those animals knew. These animals never doubt their natures at all, and slight variations from this absolute knowledge of themselves is what enables certain animals like dogs, elephants, and dolphins, and crows to exhibit some level of human recognizable intelligence. Who knows? Maybe someday whatever caused the cognitive dissonance in humankind may cause a similar event in another animal. I won't hold my breath though, because I strongly suspect that the shape of humankind's cranium played a significant role in the emergence of this dissonance, because within this space, a logarithmic spiral can expand, reflect within the boundaries of the cranium, and interfere with scaled echoes of itself in very precise ways, such that it performs the function of a complex organizing principle for the development of the brain structure. This is why scientists today speculate on the holographic nature of reality, and I suspect it is because the brain is essentially a holographic device. Astrological thinking developed along this line of thought too, although most astrologers are now completely unaware of why astrology works. You see, the natal chart is just a hologram of the rising sign's intent, just as the brain is a hologram of this intent in physical form. Both are representations of something much deeper, that is, the singularity of intent. The natal chart is drawn up with symbols and angles, while the brain is configured with organic fatty molecules that are controlled by the thalamus and projected into the cortex, the six-layered cortex. The freedom of choice which we enjoy as human beings is really unique in that we can choose any aspect or configuration within the limitless space of self-ignorance we envision in our heads to be. Within this perceived limitless space, we form convictions that shape and sustain and constrain this perceived space into structures and restrictions. We then perceive these structures and restrictions which we have created as our reality. Like blindfolded men or women feeling their way around a large complex house, we often stumble across regularities which we recognize and call truths or laws, but we also stumble across curious aspects of the void of self-ignorance which we have no recognition of and which we cannot relate to in any sensible way. These are the mysteries and curiosities of our being in our heads, and they are more numerous than we would like to acknowledge. Being addicted means that we have stumbled upon some of these mysteries and seek to probe them further. However, like Alice through the looking glass, once the probe begins, we are captivated by the allure of simplicity within reach, but are left mesmerized when simplicity evaporates before our eyes to reveal stupendous, mind-bending complexities. Commentary. It is at this point that I connect the literature to the issue of addiction. And the literature review was necessary because I'm trying to elucidate or trying to point out that addiction literally is the pursuit of some type of mystery, the solution to a kind of mystery deep within the psyche that we can perceive because we're telling ourselves stories. The ability of us to tell ourselves stories and the way we tell ourselves that stories, that's what we call our self-consciousness or our self-awareness. And the container for that self-awareness is what we call the rising sign or the ascendant, because it is what allows us to tell a story about who we think we are to ourselves. Now, this might come as a shock to most astrologers because most people think that the ascendant is how other people see you. That is not true. The way other people see you is your descendant. Okay? Because that's where you meet the other. Your ascendant is the story that you are telling yourself. It is the way that you see yourself. And so it is the way that you tend to project yourself outward, not just yourself, but your whole life. It is the container within which your entire life is being played out. That's really what it is. Okay? Your descendant is what people see when they try to engage with you, because that is how you present yourself to the other. And so the what we call human life is really a negotiation between the ascendant and the descendant. And how far we succeed in this negotiation, that is what determines how far we rise in life. And that's what's represented by the vertical line that runs from the IC to the midheaven. It is our potential. It is the potential of that horizontal axis. The negotiation taking place between the two angles, the ascendant and the descendant. So it is within this context that I'm going to explain the nature of addiction. Okay? So moving on. Earlier I said that I'll just reread that because it is important for connecting to the next chapter. Like Alice looking through the looking glass, Once the probe begins, we are captivated by the allure of simplicity within reach, but are left mesmerized when simplicity evaporates before our eyes to reveal stupendous mind-bending complexities. The allure of these complexities is that they often look deceptively simple and enticingly within reach of our understanding. But as soon as we engage them, we are transported into another realm of reality where our consciousness and our understanding of ourselves seems to melt away to reveal a deeper layer just beyond our reach. On and on we go. Deeper and deeper we follow the white rabbit down the proverbial hole in search of that final simplicity, that deeper level of understanding and awareness, wherein which we can catch a glimpse of what we really are. All levels of addiction and dependence are variations on this unconscious exploratory theme, and it is on the back of this idea that self-consciousness itself can be envisioned as one long process of addiction and dependence to self-ignorance. Commentary. Now I need you to listen to this part again, because I'm basically going into the heart of what it means for addiction. I'm saying that the type of self-consciousness and self-awareness which we use to form the sense of I is itself an addictive process. Without being addicted, we are addicted. There's something in our head that we're addicted to. That's what allows us to form the sense of self which we perceive as an I. And that when we find addiction, when we find people that are addicted, we seem to have lost control of that sense of I. It has now become some sort of compulsive behavior, which we no longer can directly control with the sense of I that we have created. But that is just an offshoot of the addictive process, which we call self-consciousness or self-awareness. Moving on. It is this exploration into the infinite number of doorways which exist in the void of our self-ignorance that delta FSOB, the master control protein, attempts to coordinate admission to by enabling accessibility. When it becomes overexpressed in the brain during addiction and dependence, it suggests that the number of accessible potential exploratory doorways have increased. As such, delta FSOB, rather than being a cause of addiction and dependence, is rather simply just evidence of addiction and dependence gone awry. The actual cause of addictive behavior and dependence is psychological, and so therefore open to astrological explanations. Commentary. Now, what I'm saying is that this delta FSOB splice protein, which has been fingered by the scientific community in the issues of addiction and dependence, that is not really the cause of addiction and dependence, but rather evidence of addiction and dependence. Okay? And that what this gene does is to open up doorways within the mind that allows us to explore deeper and deeper, or further and further, our sense of self. And that during the addictive process, this entire process is hijacked and it goes awry. It begins to malfunction, becomes impaired. And that the origin for that impairment is psychological. And as long as it is psychological, then it is open to astrological explanations. And that's what we're going to do now. If you have stayed with me so far, well done. It can get complex, but it is important to get to the root of what something really is, especially when we're talking astrology. Because that's how you help people, by understanding the root drives or the root causes or the root motivations. And these are what astrological this is what the astrological language was built for. It was built for the exploration of root drives, motivational drives, okay, fundamental concepts, because these are the things upon which we build and extend reality. Okay. So these root drives or motivational fundamental motives, they build a sense of self, and then from the sense of self they project a reality, and that becomes our reality. Okay. So to understand what is really going on in the case of addiction, you need to listen further. Moving on. The defining behavioral trait in addiction and dependence is the seduction of unconscious psychological exploration and compulsion in addition to obsession. In addiction, a native is invariably pulled towards the potential for reward, even though this might entail adverse consequences. Hence, addictive behavior involves the suspension of that which regulates the awareness of consequence. These, though, are secondary effects. Addiction's primary impulse is the desire to unconsciously access exploratory doorways into the void that is our awareness of self. It represents unanswered curiosities about self that have somehow become caught in a loop in the unconscious part of the psyche. These curiosities represent other realities of self-awareness trapped within the unconscious psyche as bubbles of curiosities, which our complex brains attempt to simplify by visiting and revisiting in an attempt to resolve the central curiosity into simplicity. Astrologically, we are in the realm of the great unknown, or the unknown beyond the conscious self. Traditionally, this would be the realm of Neptune, the longing for divinity, which simply translates into the longing for absolute truth. However, Neptune by itself cannot lead to the effect of addiction and dependence. Although there are arguments to be had that Neptune hugging one of the angles could by itself lead to addictive tendency and maybe dependence. Addicts are not necessarily drug-dependent people, but all drug-dependent people are addicts. Take gambling addiction, for instance. The attraction is towards risky behavior, promising the high of a sudden reward, all the while paying little attention, if any, to the adverse conditions of loss, which ultimately occur more frequently than any wins, because the physical laws of the universe are built that way. Why then do people engage in this type of behavior? From the perspective of all I have explained prior, we may now understand why. There must exist the possibility of certain realities in the infinite unknown reality representing the totality of ignorance of the self, where the native is convinced he is a serial winner of chance risky events. I'll read that again. There must exist the possibility of certain realities in the infinite unknown reality representing the totality of ignorance of the self, where the native is convinced he is a serial winner of chance risky events. Commentary. What this statement simply means is that the addictive behavior implies that within the psyche, right? Take gambling addiction, for instance. Within the psyche, even though the laws of probability are built in such a way that you would most likely lose in a gambling event than succeed. That's how the laws of physics are built. That's how the laws of probability are built. Yet people are drawn to this over and over again. I mean, you have an entire city of Las Vegas built on the laws of probability. Okay? And that city wouldn't have grown if the laws of probability were any different. It means that the house most likely always wins. And yet people are drawn to this because what it really is and what's really happening is that deep down within the psyche, the individual can intuit and perceive a reality within the totality of their ignorant self. They can perceive a reality wherein they are serial winners of chance risky events. That compulsion is so strong, that perception is so strong that it pulls the individual to revisit the possibility over and over again, even though the laws of physics don't change. And then when this process goes into overdrive or out of control, that becomes an addictive behavior. Now replace gambling with anything. It could be drugs, it could be alcohol, it could be smoking, it could be anything. It could be sex. Okay? It's still the same thing. That within the individual psyche, there is a template, a type of template of perfection, where in this perfection, the individual is a serial success. Anytime they're engaging in or exploring this type of behavior. And that's why, because of that template, any loss or any adverse effect, which is more likely, is shrugged off. It doesn't register within the psyche. Because the individual is constantly trying to reaffirm something that is not true. They're drawn to this. It is that compulsive drawing behavior towards this preconceived reality. That is the nature of addiction. Okay? Moving on. I'll read it again. There must exist the possibility of certain realities in the infinite unknown reality representing the totality of ignorance of the self, where the native is convinced he is a serial winner of chance risky events, in the case of gambling, that is. The possibility of the existence of such a consistent reality is somehow encoded within the native's unconscious definition of self in ways that are not fully understood by the native, because their awareness originates from the unconscious and only vaguely makes its way into the conscious mind. Such a curiosity is attractive to the conscious mind, and every time one of these elusive realities is actualized in physical reality, it is accompanied by a massive rush of dopamine through one of the 6 major dopaminergic pathways in the brain. This high is so powerful and rewarding that its release eventually becomes an aim in itself without care for physical consequences. This is the nature of addiction, and anyone displaying such compulsive behavior can be said to be addicted. To become addicted, though, there needs to exist the ability of the brain to switch between a vast number of alternate realities in search of the one which triggers the high. It is this search function that delta FSOB performs in the brain. Commentary. Now, this is not a peer-reviewed scientific conclusion. These are my conclusions. Okay? Moving on. Now, let us break all this down astrologically. It is clear that Neptune alone and its comfort within the chart cannot be responsible for addiction. There's just too much going on, so I reckon there must be other connections. Neptune must find a strong connection in its relationship with the moon, since the moon depicts the unconscious aspects of ourselves. The moon must also find its ability to explore the unconscious in Jupiter, or this exploratory desire is blocked by aspects to Saturn. So, the central problem becomes a Moon, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune relationship, which has become overexcited and thrown into overdrive, either by placements or aspects. The master control switching aspect of the biochemical delta FSOB is a Mercury-Saturn sent into overdrive by connection to Pluto. The psychological trigger which pushes a native's predisposition to addiction into actual addiction may come from a planet constricted and denied expression by Saturn. This could be any planet in the chart, but in the case of clinical depression, it is usually Mars. Since the reward systems in our brains are the normal processes by which we consolidate the use of our imagination in goal-directed behavior, overuse leads to abuse and loss of control over our conscious selves. So we can therefore see that the addictions which cause problems in our lives are those that we have allowed to go too far, such that normal functioning and control of our conscious mind is impaired. Our goals have become the wrong ones. This suggests that the Moon, Jupiter, Neptune relationship now stands in opposition to the social norms of society indicated by Saturn. Finally, the compulsive obsessive behavior characteristic of dependence predicates on Pluto's position and overall delineation or other significant planets in Scorpio. On this note, I must emphasize a point. Drug dependence is a physical response from the body. The obsessive and compulsive desire of dependence will manifest in anyone exposed chronically to addictive substances. The degree to which this desire rises and wanes is what the position of Pluto and its aspects hint at. Those who have significant Pluto and Scorpio aspects within their natal charts will experience a greater degree of dependence than those without. But paradoxically, this also equips them with the will to overcome such dependence once they have convinced themselves of the need to do so, because significant Scorpio and Plutonic themes transform fear into willpower. At the heart of the tendency towards addiction and dependence is the unmistakable fingerprint of Neptune and the Moon, or Pisces and Cancer. Thus, the tendency towards addiction is revealed for what it really is, the compulsive seductive tendency of uncontrollable emotions to overwhelm the power of reason. Another scenario occurs when uncomfortable planets with difficult aspects are placed in the 12th house. This house demands a dissolution of ego in preparation for the natural end of life, which the individual mind perceives as a journey into the great unknown, akin to the perception of other realities. This also presents unique challenges from the point of view of addictive tendencies. The tendency is quite different from that which I have described above in ways which I will explain. The tendency towards addiction in this scenario is brought about as a result of planets which promote individual consciousness, such as the personal planets, being placed in the 12th house. These planetary energies have as their primary motive the consolidation and action of ego. This is not possible in the 12th house, simply because any individualized ego placement in the 12th house dissolves into a huge number of tiny little ego fragments, which cannot in any sensible way be traced back to individual motive. The original ego desire instead manifests as a tangential consequence of interacting selflessly with multitudes of people. In physical reality, this dissolution of ego translates into the ability to deal with multitudes of people without recourse to personal relationships that may be driven by individual motives. With personal planets in the 12th, natives struggle to understand why their individual ambitions and desires never seem to materialize into anything substantial in physical reality. This creates a frustrated desire and ego. Two options are available to the ego motive in this condition. The first option is to dissolve the ego externally into a multitude of fragments, which find expression in selfless service to others. The second option is to take the individual ego on an internal journey, in search of realities which should otherwise be externalized. The difference between the two options is usually down to a native's predisposition to the fear of powerlessness, which is a Plutonic or Scorpionic theme. Commentary. Now, I've talked about addiction, which is a result of the combination or the interaction of several planets, being the Moon, Neptune, the Jupiter-Saturn link in the chart, and the obsessive compulsiveness of Pluto. So in addiction, there is a relationship between these planets, and it is usually not a relationship that can be internalized, which you find with the trine and the sextile. But usually these are difficult angles. These are creative angles, like the square, the opposition, linking all these planets together, and maybe the conjunction itself. And so the individual is forced to externalize the behavior of these planetary psychic energies, and they can then begin to look for the resolution of those stressful aspects in physical reality, as some type of narrative playing out in their life. But in this particular section, I'm talking about a different type of process, which is essentially a 12th house process. Now, when the personal planets like the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, to a certain extent even Jupiter, when they find themselves in the 12th house, things begin to dissolve, especially because these personal planets, especially the Sun and Mars, right, their central functions are predicated on the concentration of ego, the bringing of ego to a point. Now, this is not possible in the 12th house, because the 12th house is not a house of ego. It's a house where ego actually dissolves into nothing. And by nothing, I don't mean absolute nothing. I mean ego becomes fragmented into a multitude of pieces. Okay? And the reason for this is because in the 12th house, the psyche is contemplating the end of life. Okay? So the 12th house, that is what the 12th house is mainly concerned with. It has other interpretations in astrology, but from an evolutionary point of view, starting from Aries all the way to Pisces, the 12th house is concerned about the end of the journey of life. So what your people are concerned with in that house is the kind of legacy they leave behind. Now, when you find the ego, a centralized ego like the Sun or the Martian ego in the 12th house, then there is a internal battle that is going on, because the Sun tries to concentrate self-awareness into a point, which is the ego, and the Martian ego tries to concentrate its focus or its energy to a point in the world so it can act in the world. But these things are not possible in the 12th house. Every time the native tries, they don't really go anywhere. And that's because the way ego behaves in the 12th house is like putting salt in water, or sugar, a cube of sugar in water. It just dissolves. Now, the sugar is still in there, but it has dissolved into so many tiny fragments. It has now dissolved into molecules. Okay? And that's exactly what happens to the ego in the 12th house. It dissolves into a molecular form. Now, the best use of that energy is for dealing with the faceless masses. And I'm not talking about a group of people. I'm talking of the faceless masses, the people of the world. So if you have particular energies in the 12th house, then your only, personal energies in the 12th house, then your only course of action is to spread yourself over the people of the world. You have to give yourself over to them. Okay? In function and form. So It is a house that is perfect for mass media of some kind, especially if Mercury is in the 12th. Okay. Now, if the sun is in the 12th, then you must act towards the service of the whole world. You must be able to sublimate that ego. Otherwise, it will go in the other direction. The other direction is addiction. Because the individual ego goes on an internal journey in search of realities which should otherwise be externalized. Now, that internal journey is the search for that elusive reality wherein which they are something that their imagination feels. And then they pursue this and pursue this and pursue this with an obsessive compulsive drive. But they never get to it. It's like looking for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Okay? That is the nature of addiction. So, moving on. In both instances of these scenarios of astrological configurations, which suggest addictive and dependent tendencies within the natal chart, the difference lies between these two behavioral tendencies. The first is the tendency to explore and wander into alternate realities, where unconscious motives might find their way into conscious reality, while the second is the fear which comes from being compelled to dissolve the ego, much like in death. Resolution of addiction in the first case involves grounding of the moon's peculiar curiosities hosted in the unconscious part of the mind, so that its strong connection to Neptune finds another way to express itself. This psychological grounding involves examining and treating disaffectations between the native and his or her mother, and treating his or her mother or primary caregiver. It involves recreating environments which mimic the unconditional safety and security of mother's love. So, in a sense, this first scenario of addictive behavior is akin to always trying to figure out a way back home, because mother's love is simple, uncomplicated, and complete, and this is what is continuously being searched for by the addict. When this security is achieved, unconscious desires find a more direct route into consciousness. The whole therapeutic process involves going deep into the individual to rewire the brain in a way that can only be described as a redemption. The general idea is to give the solar ego a chance to reassert its authority as the organizing principle of the psyche. It is also interesting to note the similarities between the longing for soulmate love and addictive tendencies. Commentary. Now, the astrology of soulmate love is another lecture that I gave prior to this one, and very interesting lecture, and I'll do a podcast on that for those who might be interested in the delineation of that, what that means, because it is pretty important. Soulmate love is true love, and if you are lucky enough to find it in this life, then you have no idea what you have found. You have found something that is beyond belief. Okay, so moving on. Resolution of the second scenario of addictive behavior involves surrender of the ego, and the manner of this will be prescribed within the natal chart itself through aspects of the planets located in the 12th house. This resolution often involves major lifestyle changes because our egos are implicated in almost everything we do. By letting go of the ego urge in the 12th, our ego desire to be and do for ourselves disappears. The ego, as carried by the personal planets, is sacrificed in the service of others. But in reality, what happens is that the ego, dissolved into numerous tiny fragments, is now carried by the multitude of others in numerous tiny bits towards the original intention. In this way, the native with personal planets in the 12th resolves the strain they feel, and the compulsive need for the internal journey dissipates. The native can now relate more readily with external manifestations of their ego in the multitude of others they serve, once the initial difficulty with letting go has been achieved. On a final note, this podcast is not a tool for diagnosing addiction or dependence of any kind. Never hesitate to seek professional medical help if you are under the influence of addictive substances or if dependence has now become a lifestyle for you. Commentary. Now, this is the end of the article, and I hope that you've enjoyed it and you've been able to derive some meaning from it. But just to summarize, there are two pathways for the addictive behavior. Now, one involves the linkage or the interaction of the moon, Neptune, the Jupiter-Saturn behavior, and the planet Pluto. in some type of stressful configurational aspects with each other. Now, the second involves the personal planets in the 12th house. And I've basically suggested that once you have personal planets in the 12th house, for instance, then there's always the temptation to go or to pursue the internal journey. Okay, because the 12th house basically calls for a lot of solitude because of what's taking place there, because it is the preparation of life for an end. So life begins to contemplate the world, the nature of the world beyond the self, because the world was here before the self got here, and the world is going to be here long after the self is gone. So this is what preoccupies the self, the psyche, at that in the 12th house. Now, when you have personal planets in the 12th house, the manner in which the ego is actualized in the world takes two parts. It can either go internal and then pursue, because based on this legacy, there's a lot of imagining going on. And when the ego runs away with the imagination, the individual or the psyche begins to pursue a kind of reality that is only implicit within their imagination. And this is a route towards that addictive behavior, if care is not taken. Now, the other route is the individual can seek to externalize this by accepting the fragmentation of the self, the total dissolution of the ego, which essentially must be connected to the entire world, the faceless masses. And that's why one of the key dissipating strategies for 12th house energies is service to the multitude of people. You need to stop serving yourself and serve God. And you now assume that God is found in the multitude of people that you serve. That's why it's called selfless service. You give up an aspect of your ego. Now, the funny thing is this. Take for instance, when you have a desire or you have a want, or your ego wants something, then the sun basically constructs a self that can actually create that thing that it wants, or the Martian impulse can simply just go and take it. That's how these energies work. Now, but when these energies are in the 12th house, you cannot do that. All attempts to construct a sense of self and ego that is concentrated, it fails. Now, in Mars, you just can't go and take it because you can't even imagine what it is you need to. Every time you go and try to take it, it dissolves within your reach. It dissolves in front of you like a mirage. So you keep getting frustrated. Now, the way to achieve the desires of that ego is to dissipate the sense of that ego into into a sort of molecular structure, okay, whereby it is the act of selfless service to others that brings you that thing that you want eventually, and it brings it to you in abundance. That is why the 12th house and Neptune in general can become the energy of tremendous abundance. I'm talking about gifts and money or whatever it is you're looking for coming from the entire world, from people that you don't know, people you will never have a chance of knowing or meeting, and yet they will be beneficial to you. Okay, that's what a lot of people miss. They think that money is only restricted to a certain type of planet or a certain type of house. That's not true. You see, astrology is a science of holism. It's holistic. It's not. You cannot reduce it into individual parts. Even though what it codes for, it's a language that codes for your root drives and your root motivations. You see, so money is not really coded in the astrological chart. I mean, what is money? Nature didn't create money. Okay, rather what is coded are desires. And if your desire is for money, then there's a way that plays out. Okay, so this is essentially the astrology of addiction. And I hope that you have understood it, and I hope that you have enjoyed it. It's a bit long and it gets pretty technical, especially with the concepts of gene splicing and the delta FSOB protein. But the general idea is to get a true understanding of what addiction really is. You see, it's like within the addictive personality senses or can see a type of reality within themselves. If only they can just get there. If only they can just get there. And that's how it goes. If only I can just get there. And maintaining the vision the perception of this reality, is why the mind needs to be altered to pursue this. Now, but I'm not saying addiction is people who are addicts, they need help. That's really what it is. And there's a lot of there are so many forms of addiction. Most of it is unnamed. But addiction is a personality type. It's a personality property. In fact, it is a property of self-awareness. In fact, I came to the conclusion that the entire process of self-awareness is an addictive property in itself. We are all high in some way. And it is that highness that allows us to construct a sense of self that is not really there. The I is not there. It doesn't exist. It is something that we make up every day based on how we record memories, how we process time. When you take, that's why in the 12th house, the sense of self starts to struggle. Because these are not properties of the 12th house. The 12th house removes time. It basically removes space and dissolves everything into a kind of nothingness. But that nothingness is another form of being. In fact, one can argue that nothingness is the essential form of being because it is the truth of being, as contrasted to Saturnian reality that is very hard and material. But even modern day physics tells you that at the base, the best description of material reality is quantum field theory. And a field is nothing, it's just a set of numbers. All right. Thank you for listening.